Okay, fantastic. Hi, Sebastian. How are you?
Hi, good to meet you. I'm good. I'm good.
So, Sebastian Hallensleben. I've practiced the family name. Hope I got it right. And I'll let you introduce yourself in just a second. I'll say I feel privileged that you made the time with your hectic calendar. And the reason I'm so happy that you were able to make the time is because I think you're the most organic or natural person to continue the conversation that I had with Kai Zenner, who was working on the EUAI Act from a legislative perspective. And you, as I hope you'll explain better than me, are leading the standardization effort that's tied into that. And before revealing all the topics on the conversation, I'll just hand it over to you. I think it'll be interesting to not only understand what you're doing today, but also a little bit about your path and what led you to it, and what's the passion behind it.
Yeah, thank you for opening up this opportunity to walk through some of the issues that we're covering in particular the European AI governance space. So I'm wearing a number of hats. So I am chairing the committee that is creating harmonized standards for the AI Act, and we'll probably talk about that, I think. I'm also co-chairing the AI risk and accountability work at the OECD. We might also touch on that. And I'm heading Digital Trust and AI at BDE, at German Engineering Association. But before all those hats, in previous lives, I actually started out as a physicist, and some say I'm still a physicist at heart in terms of understanding the world through models, in terms of putting a lot of emphasis on data, but also in terms of a certain playfulness and a certain kind of curiosity on how the world actually works. And in between, I've had plenty of roles in IT, in telecoms, in financial services, coding trading systems, running IT production teams and development teams. And over time, slipping into situations and projects where conflict had to be resolved and consensus had to be built. And this is, of course, something that is very high on the agenda for standardization. And although I didn't know it at the time, these were kind of training rounds for the current AI standardization.
Amazing. I can only feel a lot of empathy and resemblance to how points are connecting in hindsight, right? You did a lot of things that now from your position, it seems very logical, but at the time of being, you didn't strategically think or build that road. It somehow evolved organically. So it's the same in my case. So it's nice to hear. And yeah.
It's actually true. I mean, the significance of many events only happens and kind of becomes clear in hindsight. And even if we look at the way that AI is being standardized, you and I were part of the IEC group that was looking at kind of the early thinking around how to get AI ethics into standardization, or how to get AI ethics handled through the mechanics and processes of standardization. At the time, it was really exploratory and just an idea that this could be done. And what that IEC committee achieved, in my view, was, yeah, that proof of concept. And a lot of that thinking is now also kind of mainstream thinking, if you like, in European AI standardization.
So since you mentioned that, we know through that platform ever since 2019, I believe that we met face to face. And honestly, I was a bit skeptic, and you proved me wrong. And kudos to you on that. Not that it's important to have ethics, which I usually refer to as trustworthiness through the work of standardization, but we're talking about the same thing. And I really think you were innovative back then in the way you think of employing the mechanisms and the platforms that we already have, and focus it and direct it in a positive way. So you have my appreciation for that always. And with that, I can jump directly into the first hat that you mentioned, which is chairing JTC 21. For those of you who don't know or confuse it with other JTCs around the world, this specific one is under CENELEC, which is the regional standardization body developing the standards for the EU. But I'm guessing you'll have a better explanation than me and a more in-depth one. So connecting it to the previous conversation, I think the question is, now that the legislation was voted on with majority of votes, where does it leave standard? What does it mean for the world of standardization in AI?
Well, I'd like to contrast it with a previous piece of regulation coming out of the EU that caused a lot of grief, not only in industry, but also beyond. And that was the General Data Protection Regulation.
Yeah.
And one of the big amounts of grief that it caused was that everyone was interpreting GDPR differently. Even within Germany, the country I come from, there's 16 regional data protection authorities, and initially all 16 of them had their own interpretations of GDPR, and the same repeated across Europe, and the same repeated across many companies. And a lot of that pain really came from the fact that the regulation is quite high level, it's quite abstract in many cases. So if we now look at the AI Act, it's also quite high level and quite abstract. So you could say, oh, is something as bad or as difficult as GDPR going to happen? And the very, very fortunate answer is no, because for the AI Act, we're using a mechanism that is called the so-called new legislative framework. But this is an approach that has been around for 40 years and been used in many other contexts, just not in GDPR. And the typical core of the new legislative framework is a division of labor. It's a synergy between regulation that prescribes the high-level objectives and requirements, and standardization that fills in the details. So to make it more specific, the AI Act says that an AI system under certain circumstances, high-risk use, and so on, needs to be transparent. But the AI Act does not say what transparency is. However, there will be harmonized standards that do exactly that, that describe what is transparency, how do you measure it, how do you prove that you are transparent in the sense of the AI Act. So for that mechanism to work, a few things need to come together. First of all, the European Commission has a special relationship with the 3 European standardization organizations. So that's CEN, CENELEC, and ETSI. And the Commission issues a mandate, a request, a standardization request to the European standardization organizations to develop so-called harmonized standards to underpin a piece of regulation, in this case, the AI Act. Now, I'm slipping in that word harmonized without explaining what it is, so I should catch up on that. A harmonized standard is a standard that is officially recognized by the European Union. It's even published alongside regulation in the official journal of the EU. Mm-hmm. And it comes with a so-called presumption of conformity. So that means if you follow the standard, the automatic assumption is that you are in conformance, in compliance with the regulation. So in the example, you don't have to worry about what transparency in the AI Act is actually supposed to mean. As long as you follow a future harmonized standard for transparency, you're automatically assumed to be in compliance with the AI Act. And so that gives you legal certainty and a recognized path to implementation. And it's important to, as a side note, that this does not make harmonized standards mandatory. So you can ignore them. You can say, well, I've got my own way of achieving transparency of AI, but then the burden of proof is on you to really kind of demonstrate it's compliant with the AI Act. So it's kind of maybe the more difficult path or more demanding path. This more straightforward path is the one through harmonized standards.
Yeah, the compliance and the liability that comes with it. So I think it's just like Drago says, if you want to go the GDPR way, using it as an example, you can, but we offer you this time something a little bit different. And I think that from a business perspective, even before looking at it as a regulator itself, just when you think of as businesses working in such a global atmosphere with a lot of uncertainty, the more certainty you can bring to the table, the better for everyone, the businesses and the regulators. And that mechanism that you just described brings more clarity and lowers the risk, lowers the uncertainty, which is an amazing thing. So I'm happy you're leading that effort in JTC 21. And obviously there's a direct local influence on all the member states of the EU. Do you see any good influence that's going to trickle down and kind of filter into other countries, or do you think there's going to be a backlash, or do you see other efforts in other direction?
Well, we already see a certain kind of Brussels effect with the AI Act, in that it's being watched very, very carefully by other countries. There are quite a few countries that like it. There are many countries who observe it quite keenly. And that also kind of transfers to European standards on AI. Because, yeah, as we talked earlier, the European standards on AI are the path towards implementing the AI Act. For example, there's been a delegation from Japan sitting in on the JTC 21 plenaries for more than a year, one to 2 years now. I've only heard this morning that there's a strong interest from Australia to follow European work, because the current Australian government really sees the AI Act as a role model to also be kind of copied or be inspired by in Australia, but to some extent. We have a lot of interest from Canada to observe what's happening in JTC 21. So there are multiple countries, and of course yourself as well from an Israeli perspective. So there are lots of countries around the world who take a keen interest in what's happening, and that pertains both to the regulation itself, but also the standards that go with it.
I'll tell you why I'm smiling. It's not apparent why. It's a very tight community of experts around the world that's been working together in the last few years, even for the countries that you mentioned, which are not part of the EU, but we met in different platforms that are global. And I don't know if I've mentioned it to you, but I'm also working very closely with SCC in Canada, Standardization Council for Canada, in better aligning the efforts that we're having in Israel with what they're doing, because I think they're a few steps ahead of us in the way government is organized around standardization, giving it the right place with regulation development, a little bit like the EU is doing, subsidizing it accordingly, which is an amazing model to learn from. Obviously, the pilots that they're having of government with businesses to promote the implementation of standards through different verticals. So I've been working with them, and I'm a keen kind of pushing behind behind the curtain for them to join. And the funny story about Australia is, which is also a great model to observe as Israel, I'm speaking now, not as the EU, with the way they've constructed CSIRO 61 and the way government is budgeting the work in standardization from a technical perspective. So I really wish Israel was in par with those two countries. And so literally while I was in the sessions of JTC 21 in Dublin a month ago together with you, I got messages from Orly about them wanting to join. So I'm happy to see that's moving forward, and it's definitely two countries that are a force to be reckoned with for good in their ability to contribute to the conversation. So that's great news. And with all that positivity in the air, I have to also ask you about the challenges or the risks that you're seeing from your unique vantage points of multiple HUDs, but even more specifically through JTC 21 and the process that we've just described on maybe where things can go wrong and what are the challenges or what needs to be done the right way for us to succeed in this path.
Yeah, I think it's important to maybe start off by spelling out what standardization actually is. And on the most fundamental level, standardization has two steps. It is about creating a consensus between everyone who is affected by a standard, and then writing down that consensus in such a clear and concise way that engineers can follow it in their day-to-day technical work. And both of those steps are really important. The consensus building step is actually encoded in the rules and regulations of standardization organizations. So they very specifically spell out that all relevant stakeholders have to be involved. And this is not just a, well, let's see who comes principle, but this is actually an active duty on the offices of standardization activities, including myself as the chair. If I realize that a group is missing that should be on the table for a given standardization activity, I need to try to bring them to the table. Now, in the case of AI, stakeholders knock on the door anyway, so that part is relatively easy. But it is important to recognize that standardization is consensus building of all relevant stakeholders. And that includes consumers, it includes trade unions, it includes small businesses, large businesses, includes old industry, new industry, startups, small, medium enterprises that have been around maybe for 10 generations, different sectors, different maturities, different countries, and so on. So it's really, because AI is such a broad topic and so broadly applicable, the range of stakeholders is particularly broad as well. And it's also reflected in the size of JTC 21. So within JTC 21, we've got around 140 registered experts. But JTC 21, like any other European standardization committee, is mirrored on a national level. And in the case of AI, 21 countries are already following the work of JTC 21, are providing input, are voting on drafts and proposals, are making proposals for new work items, are discussing them. And if you count the experts engaged in those national mirror committees, in addition to JTC 21, you've got somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 experts across Europe engaged with European AI standardization and having to reach a consensus on what it should look like. So it is a massive consensus building exercise. JTC 21 is, as far as I know, the biggest ever standardization committee at the European level, which just reflects the importance of the topic and in many ways is helpful because it means that for the various facets of JTC 21, we do have experts available. But it also means that consensus building is, of course, a greater challenge than it might be if you have a committee for one very, very specific, narrow technical topic. An additional challenge is, of course, the limited time that we have available. For harmonized standards to really be helpful in implementing and satisfying regulation, they have to be finished and available well in time before the AI Act comes into force. And for most parts of the AI Act, that will be sometime April or May 2026, so 2 years from now. And that means the harmonized standards really need to be ready by autumn 2025, which is next year. And in standardization term, that's just a blink of an eye. Fortunately, we're not starting from scratch now. So JTC 21 already started its work in July 2021, and a predecessor group, the AI focus group at CENELEC, has already been active since 2019. So there is a lot of work that has already happened, and most of the work items are underway and kind of well developed. So that it's a challenge, but it's feasible to have meaningful standards by then. And we are actually very deliberately adopting international work wherever it's available, because it simply saves time. And it also means that the divergence between European and international standards is kept as small as possible. But this is actually a bone of contention and leads to discussions in JTC 21, because the preferences and the views of different stakeholders differ quite a bit on whether an international standard is kind of good enough and close enough to European needs, or whether it actually needs to be modified or kind of complemented for European purposes, or whether Europe needs to develop its very own standard for a certain aspect of AI. That can lead to long discussions and animated discussions. But yeah, this is part of the consensus building process,
which is a massive undertaking. So my congratulations and my condolences for being for leading that massive undertaking of consensus. I did write myself a point that I want to highlight, that I loved it, how you articulated it, which is sometimes missed in the conversation, even by myself. When I speak about standards, it's basically for engineers. What we want for the process, using the example of GDPR, is for an engineer, for a CTO, for an AI product person to be able to read the standards and implement them without having to have a lawyer by their side. Not that having a lawyer is a bad thing. We need them in the conversation, that's fine. but not to the sense that you have to have one just to understand or to interpret the law by yourself. So I love that point, and I say that being an engineer myself. And I can say from my own experience that the timeline is challenging, and the reassuring part of the work started a little bit before, already from 2019, as you described it, is keeping me hopeful. And yes, I can say, if just contributing to the conversation, again, from my own hat, my own perspective of Israel, what I think is missing is that the way the mechanism is built now through the AI Act is something that some countries are still not adapt to, from how they're organized around standardizing IT or governing IT through regulation. And so some countries like Canada have those experts, I say in-house, right, as civil servants, as full-time employees doing the work in the different committees. I hope in a year's time that would change, and it won't be only me promoting standardization for the sake of safer AI, but we'll have more people around the table. So with that being said, I think we touched about the positive sides and the challenges of the EU locally. And obviously, as you've mentioned through one of your hats of being active in the OECD as co-chair for risk, I'm also involved in the OECD together with you and in other committees of the AI Index, for example, which is very important work that started recently. And I think it all ties in, basically, the effort going on there, and ISO internationally, and CENELEC JTC 21 locally. And I'm curious on, from your unique vantage point, your additional hats that you have, how do you view it? How do you view that challenge of orchestrating the international and national efforts?
Yeah, so if we look at the European level, obviously the European AI Act applies to European countries or to organizations active within the EU, despite the Brussels effect kind of going softly beyond, but the hard regulation only applies within Europe. So the question is, what happens internationally? And which international governmental organizations would be able to drive international AI regulation? If we look at the UN organizations, there are various activities underway. There were the UNESCO principles on ethical AI. There was implementation work, but for something that has to reach a consensus among all countries in the world with wildly different systems of government, wildly different views on fundamental values, it's very hard to go beyond kind of declarations and formulations of principles. If we have a slightly tighter circle of countries that are in some sense like-minded or similar, then it becomes a lot easier to go a few steps further. And the OECD is one such circle of similar or like-minded countries. I mean, the OECD is the organization of market democracies, to kind of describe it in a very, very concise way. And therefore, it's much, much easier for the OECD to go beyond kind of declarations. The OECD also has various precedents on regulation that have already been developed and that are already in place, including an enforcement mechanism. And the one that we are working on is the set of guidelines for multinational enterprises for responsible business conduct. These are guidelines that have been around for a decade or so, and they currently cover things like do not use child labor, do not completely mess up the environment, do not bribe local officials, kind of basics of responsible business conduct across the world if you're active as a company globally. And this framework has an enforcement mechanism. There are national contact points, there are processes for enforcement action. And a fairly recent example where enforcement action was taken was the incidents where 2 dams in Brazil broke and released waste, mining waste, across whole valleys and communities, and hundreds of people died, and the environment was damaged very heavily. And the company that certified those dams as safe was actually being held accountable through this OECD mechanism of responsible business conduct, because it was relatively straightforward to argue that maybe certifying a dam as safe, that breaks shortly after, is probably not responsible business conduct. So I'm saying all this because this framework, this existing framework of the OECD, is going to have an additional chapter that describes basics of AI governance. And the group that I'm co-chairing is kind of drafting such a chapter. It will have to be approved on the political level. And we really have that discussion, well, what should be in this chapter? What should be in an OECD binding framework on AI governance? In particular, given that there are so many AI governance and risk management frameworks around already, there's the NIST AI risk management framework, the NIST RMF. Yeah. There are various ISO and IEC standards. There are IEEE standards. There are various other kind of good practices. That's the IEC Guide 51 for safety, that could all be kind of used as an inspiration. So we concluded that it doesn't really make sense for the OECD to build yet another AI risk management framework, but rather to go one abstraction level higher and specify the high-level objectives and requirements for AI governance. And then at the same time, refer to existing frameworks and standards as possible paths towards implementing those requirements. And if that sounds a lot like the European new legislative framework, that's because it is, and that's because this was really one of the inspirations to say, well, let's do the same at the international level. We put the high-level requirements into the regulation or kind of this binding framework, and we then refer to certain standards and certain frameworks as a possible path towards implementation. That work is underway. It'll still take a little bit of time, but I think it's kind of a best of both worlds in terms of the approach.
Amazing. Do you think, a little bit maybe off topic or circling back to locally observing the process in the EU, do you think the formation of the EU AI office to support the process throughout can leverage insights from the practical implementation of certain standards and taking it back or pulling it up to be more accurate to one abstraction layer higher? Do you think that interplay could work or could be beneficial, or is that something that's kind of a bit siloed and each effort is on its own?
It's quite early to talk about the AI office because it hasn't been fully formed yet, and I think it'll take a number of months before it's really up and running. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit early to talk about it, but the general notion that the AI Act is not the end of the discussion as far as AI governance is concerned, that is a very, very valid one. And I really see the AI office as the continuation of that work. On one hand, of course, helping to implement the AI Act, but then also continuing the discussion and continuing the thinking, well, what about all the issues and all the steps of technical progress that have happened after the AI Act was finalized? How can we react to them? What do we do about them? And kind of the view on foundation models, which was kind of, if you like, delegated to the AI office to some extent, is a good example of that.
Maybe let's do a thinking exercise. Let's say success-oriented, everything went well. Now that the EU got approved and standardization development happens the right way from a practical perspective, but also in the limits of time that it was given to, what's next? You know, and the AI office being formed, are we done then, or?
Well, it's actually a very, very interesting and very valid question, because you could, I'd like to kind of sharpen your question even further to say, well,
sure.
Let's imagine that across the world, the optimum AI regulation has been put into place. The optimum standards have been developed. The optimum approaches to AI governance have been implemented in businesses. Are we done? I mean, even that's already a very, very ambitious mental model, but are we done? And the answer is No, we're not done. We're not done at all. And the biggest reason for that is that AI is and has for considerable time been in the hands of bad actors. And bad actors don't care about regulation. They don't care about standards. They don't care about kind of good governance best practices. They've got a very different set of objectives. And that includes bad actors who are motivated commercially, but also bad actors with geostrategic motivations. Where we see this most clearly is in generative AI. And I'm actually going back considerably further than just to ChatGPT in late 2022. I'm going back at least to 2018 when deepfakes was published as the first broadly visible, broadly available technology to create arbitrary video, to make people appear to say things that they never said before, to even then to generate images, to generate profile pictures of people that looked like people with all their flaws and little imperfections, but who didn't exist. And in fact, I remember very vividly my first kind of jaw-dropping moment was a demo that I think NVIDIA published, aptly named "This person does not exist.com."
Yeah.
And yeah, every time you click on refresh, this system generates another person that does not exist. And most of those images are so good that it's impossible. It really is impossible to tell that this is not a real person. And so that technology has been around since 2018. And in the hands of bad actors, it has the potential to disrupt the digital space in a very unpleasant way. And no amount of AI governance or AI regulation is going to change that, because bad actors tend to ignore regulation and standardization. I'm putting this quite seriously because I do believe that we must invest considerable resource in that direction. So imagine, let's start with geostrategic actors. Imagine you are running Vladimir Putin's so-called Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg. So this is the outfit that has, or used to have, around 300 employees who receive their talking points from the Kremlin in the morning and then spend the day on fora, on comment sections, on social media across the world to push those talking points. Mm-hmm. And in the old times, if Putin wanted to triple the influence or to triple the kind of impact of that whole operation, he had to find 3 times as many people with the right combination of a lack of ethics, conversational skills, language skills, and he also had to feed those people and keep them happy and on side. And that put a very practical limit to the amount of disinformation that you could push into the world. Mm-hmm. Now, those scalability limits are falling away, because with generative AI, it's possible to fake any amount of content, to fake conversations, to fake whole people with profile pictures, engaging with followers, engaging in discussions, and you don't really have any scalability limit anymore. Insert your other bad actor of choice. You can kind of make the same argument and narrative for all of them. Also, if we go from the geostrategic to the commercial arena, there have always been shady review brokers who promised for a certain amount of money to get good reviews of your products published, or bad reviews of the competitions published, be it on Amazon, be it in trade journals, be it on blogs, be it in kind of so-called product review sites, and so on. And it used to be the case that these review brokers had to pay, at least in Germany, around 10 euros or so to some student, some click worker, to put a convincing fake review on Amazon. So it was actually not that cheap to get large numbers of fake reviews out. Now that shady review broker doesn't need to do that anymore. because it costs almost nothing to generate those texts. And so the whole economics of pushing fakes into the digital space has shifted fundamentally. So what we see from those examples is that the digital space is currently being flooded by fakes, by auto-generated low-quality content, by bots that simulate majorities where there are no majorities in reality, and also by bots that are experimenting with, well, how do they need to behave in order not to be moderated away? And how do they need to behave in order to influence real people? Mm-hmm. So on a very fundamental level, I was born in the 1970s when the Club of Rome raised the alarm that we are in the process of destroying our physical environment that we rely on through depletion of resources, through pollution. Now we are in a similar moment as far as the digital space is concerned. We see the digital space being polluted on a large scale by fakes and bots. And we risk losing the digital space as an environment in which we can live and do business and have societal interaction and discourse and kind of argue and hassle and build consensus and trade and everything. We've become so used to being able to do that in the digital space that losing that again and falling back to 30, 40 years ago would be a very, very drastic impact. And we really need to think about this impact of generative AI, this big, big side effect of generative AI, how to address it without the instruments of AI regulation or governance, because they don't reach bad actors.
That's a very serious challenge and threat on what the promise of the internet was supposed to be. I think I'm dwelling on what you bring to the table with that topic. It's really discerning, and I'm kind of thinking of the economics of it as a former analyst. They say in the early 2000s, people rushed around saying there's like a new world around the internet, and analysts in economics came in and said there's nothing new. There's no new economic model, although companies are being valued in multiples to what they're really bringing in revenue. It's just that we managed to lower the cost of something at scale, step function wise. And in the case of the internet, it was communication, search, and distribution, right? That you could do at scale. And I think that is the same process that we have been seeing in the last decade with AI or data science, doesn't matter how you decide to call it. But when you boil it down practically is nothing but a prediction, right? So Ilya Sutskever will say that prediction at scale creates some kind of consciousness, maybe. I don't know if that's the specific way he articulates it, but he talked about how he always hoped to, and now he thinks he has the evidence to emergent properties of some kind of an intelligence that's from scale. That's a debatable statement. But in any case, the scale issue here really plays a part. So I think along the sides of 2017-18, there was the step function wise change in the cost of prediction. That's kind of the new kind of spring of AI. And what we've seen with generative is kind of another exponent jump, another step function change in economics. That now the prediction is even cheaper at scale for non-experts. So in 2017-18, you had to be a sort of an expert just to get things running. We didn't even have MLOps back then. That's something that consolidated in the last few years in the industry, and I think it brings us to the real menace or challenge that you just articulated, because if you look at the internet today, what you have already is kind of the tip of the iceberg. And what I mean by that is you can see that the internet is slowly starting to become a non-safe, non-trusted environment, although it can be. And you're starting to have some kind of sub-digital communities that could be more trusted. So why is Discord such a hit lately? It's because it's a registered server which you run, and you have to be invited or to be approved into getting into, or to be a WhatsApp group that you have to be invited to or approved, right? There is some kind of a trust. We know you're not a bot. We're not a bad actor. That's kind of the trust environment that we want to take one step back to the part of the iceberg that we can see. So I couldn't agree more.
And you're actually touching on two very, very crucial intertwined concepts. The one is trust, and the other one is identity. We had a kind of a silent revolution, if you like, of the internet 20 years ago, roughly, give or take, when people started to use SSL encryption. And kind of there was this slow transition from HTTP as the dominant protocol to HTTPS, and you had certificate authorities springing up to verify entities. And this was really the creation of a trust infrastructure where the entities that were being checked and verified were typically organizations or website owners in very rough terms. What we now need is another big step change or another big addition to the set of protocols and infrastructures that make up the digital space. And that's for trust between people, kind of as individuals. And this cannot be based on forcing people to reveal their real names, because there are lots and lots of good reasons and places in the world where we do not want that, or simply the reason that people want to keep their business and private lives separate, or that you have a whistleblowing situation, or that there are some commercial sensitivities. So there are very, very good reasons not to force people to reveal their real names online. So you have to work with trust in people, but with some form of pseudonymous identities that are tied to real people, but without being able to trace back to real people, and also that are singular per platform or per context. So you can have one or two or maybe three such identities per platform, but not 100 or 1,000. And the interesting thing there is that this is not primarily a technology challenge, because the technology for that exists, the cryptography exists. It's more a challenge of user acceptance. And it's also a challenge of kind of balancing that give and take. So for example, if there's a new blogger that kind of crops up on the internet, and I have no idea whether to trust this person, I'm not even sure it is a person. But suppose you know this blogger and trust this blogger to some extent, and suppose that I know you and I trust your judgment. Then indirectly, that gives me a starting point where I think, well, at least provisionally, to some extent, I'm going to trust that new blogger as well. Maybe over time, my own judgment changes. And if I conclude that this blogger is just telling complete bonkers, then my trust in your judgment might suffer a little bit as well. But we're kind of in a network where we get a steer from others on who to trust and to what extent, and whether to trust that they're honest, whether to trust their judgment, whether to trust that they are a real good person. And we need the protocols to manage those myriad trust relationships, and also to kind of share information with our immediate network on who we trust to what extent. Because what we do not want to have is some sort of centralized trust score or some sort of ministry of truth. That cannot be the solution. It always has to be decentralized and more on a protocol and an infrastructure level.
I'm smiling not because it's a soft topic or a funny point. I'm smiling because the nerd, the engineer in me thinks you maybe you noticed or not, but you alluded to a decision tree describing already the algorithmic approach to how you would create trust in the actors. So we unavoidably got to a simple algorithm. And the other one is that I think we have unintentionally another topic for a future conversation, maybe around trust in the age of generative AI in the digital space, which could be fascinating to explore together. And the smiling is because that's not something I was intending to cover or even reach in this conversation, but I love how it evolved organically to topics that we're both passionate and working around. So with that, I'd like to really thank you again for making the time, because I know how busy you are. And I wish you all the best with all the work that you're leading. I think all the effort that you're doing is really remarkable. So thank you and good luck.
Thank you for the conversation. It's been great to share these thoughts, and also thank you for all your contributions in the various fora. Thank you.
My pleasure.